Alrighty, welcome to the new year, 2021. This is John for MTG Nexus, coming at you a little bit of a different kind of video, something I've been wanting to get back to for a long time, which is versus videos. This is not quite like Star City games or some of the other ones you might see on the internet where you're going to see both perspectives in the same video. Instead, what I'm going to do is we're going to be playing a couple matches from the Burn side, and then in another video we're going to see a couple of matches from the opposing side. This particular video we're going to be seeing Burn versus a version of Color Uro Omnath Pile. This is the Burn list that I'll be playing against the Uro Omnath deck, and the Uro Omnath deck is the one that you might have seen we played probably a couple weeks ago now. Didn't feature Force of Negations. The primary reason for that is borrowing cards for both decks from my Mana Traders account. There's kind of a tension there between the ability to, be able to play an entire Burn deck or have two Force of Negations in your Color Uro pile. So that's why you're not going to see the completely fully powered Uro Omnath deck, but Force of Negations only one tiny part of the Burn matchup. More often comes down to Uro Omnath or whatever sideboard cards they're packing. As far as the Burn deck, I went for about as standard a build of Boros as you can get. So none of my last things I was working on, no surgical extractions like Poseidon was working on, no Relic of Progenitus like I happen to like, no 4 copies of Roiling Vortex, just standard Boros, 20 lands, 12 creatures, the standard mix of Riftbolt and Skewer. You have at least some number of copies of Skullcrack, Lightning Helix, and Searing Blaze in the main. Nothing terribly fancy. Sideboard, pretty decent spread. 3 Path, 2 Rest in Peace, 2 Core Firewalker, 2 Roiling Vortex, the 4th Skullcrack, a couple copies of Smash Smithereens for any type of artifact shenanigans, the 4th copy of Searing Blaze, 1 copy of Searing Blood, because creature decks are kind of making a comeback, and then 1 copy of Deflecting Palm is a nice thing to have against Uro, Wormcoil Engine, any type of big nonsense you might come up in contact with, Death Shadows, etc. Scourge of the Skyclaves. Like I said, nothing too fancy. Main cards in the matchup are probably cards, at least out of the sideboard, cards like Rest in Peace, cards like Roiling Vortex, Skullcrack. Could also bring in some number of paths to deal cleanly with Uro and Omnath. Beyond that, you're just looking to kind of shut off their Uro recursion. I'm not even sure how many Rest in Peace are correct. I know I like Relic in the matchup. Rest in Peace is a little bit debatable. I think the first one's probably fine. Roiling Vortex, obviously pretty good card against their life gain strategy. Allows you to hold up mana, not get got by fetch lands and stuff. And then, beyond that, just kind of your standard Boros Burn deck. And so we're going to be working on these kind of videos this week, see how they do. As a friendly reminder, if you do like especially modern content, please consider subscribing to the channel, as this is kind of my workaround for not wanting to do terribly too many leagues with, the way Burn has been performing lately. Although I have seen some people like GG have been doing okay with Burn, so we might get back into doing some leagues as well. But this is a versus video, Boros Burn versus Color Omnath from the Boros Burn perspective. Here we are for match number 1, game number 1. Taking a look at the opening hand. So this opening hand, we're on the play, so that part is nice, obviously. Also, 3-lander, not ideal. Ideally, you want usually 2 lands, but one with them being a canopy land. Plus the fact that you have Goblin Guide and Eidolon against any type of control deck, even the blind, this is a pretty reasonable hand. Only weakness of this kind of hand in any matchup really is weakness to a turn 1 play from the opposing side. So, something like a Arbor Elf or something out of like Heliod Company or Champion of the Parish could get out of hand before we can answer it. But, against a controlling specifically type deck, if we knew we were up against that, this hand is pretty solid overall. Definitely a keep. And I'm leaning on the fetch lane here, might have been incorrect. We are thinning the deck, but we do have Blazes in our deck, which, while we're not sure what we're up against, obviously Cryptic Command would give away a good bit of information. But, that's something to consider when you're sequencing your lands, is how much information you want to give away. Once again, not giving any information away pre-combat, because it's likely our opponent has a removal spell the way they set things up. They take 2 to prevent 2, which I'm fine with. We go ahead and shock in here, play one of the Eidolons while they can't stop it. We go ahead and play Goblin Guide first, swing for combat, see if they have a play. They don't. Play the second Eidolon. They stop it with a Remand, which isn't great for them, because they take 2 damage. They take a bunch of damage here. Their mana base here coming back to get them a little bit. One of the weaknesses of the Uro Omnath deck, especially on the play, is the fact of they're very vulnerable to fast starts from aggressive decks if they don't have a very specific sequence of cards. And especially game 1, their mana base deals them a ton of damage. And sometimes it's very hard for them to sequence their 4-color mana base. Oftentimes, you're looking at a deck with maybe 4 Path to Exile, 2 Bolts at most for early interaction, besides Remands, Mana Leaks, depending on what kind of interaction they're playing. Now, obviously, a fast hand of like turn 1 removal spell or turn 2 removal spell or turn 2 counter spell into Uro without taking a bunch of damage from your lands, pretty difficult for Burn to overcome. But once again, creatures are a very big part of this style of matchup. Obviously, in the post-board games, they add things like Ether Gust, Celestial Purge, Supreme Verdict. They add a lot more interactions in games 2 and game 3. We bring in our anti-life gain stuff. Kind of a wash, but a lot of it is play draw dependent in the style of matchup, because their deck can be quite clunky, especially the first couple turns. Those are really the turns Burn needs to capitalize in the matchup. Alright, here we are for sideboarding before game number 2 and match number 1. As far as sideboarding, like I kind of mentioned in the deck tech intro, we're only boarding in 1 copy of Rest in Peace. We're boarding in a Path to Exile. You don't want to flood out too many on those kind of effects. Being able to stop the back end of Uro is nice. Being able to stop the recursion of Mystic Sanctuary is kind of nice, but you don't want to flood on that effect. It's not like Relic of Progenitus doesn't replace itself. And also, Path to Exile, they only have so many creatures you want to path, generally Uro and Omnath. Sometimes Primeval Titan in some of these lists, but the main threat obviously is Feel the Dead, getting the game going long. And being able to stop Uro from recurring life gain is quite nice, as well as Omnath, but you don't want to flood on that effect. Searing Blaze obviously doesn't answer anything 1-for-1, so not the card you generally want to see. Other than, killing zombie tokens, but by that point you're in probably some trouble anyway. And then, you board in your copies of Roiling Vortex and Skullcrack, in addition to 1 Path, 1 Rest in Peace. And let us take a look at game number 2 here, which we're going to be on the draw. This hand's, once again, pretty good. Actually, this hand is very good, potentially, depending on their interaction. We have a couple 1-drops and then a bunch of 1-drop spells. This is potentially a turn 3 kill hand. Turn 3 kill hands obviously are ones with multiple 1-drops and multiple 1-drop spells, especially if you curve out with a 3rd land. Or you just rip another Swiss Spear. Again, with Goblin Guide here, it does the most damage this turn. We're handing them a land, which obviously isn't ideal. Opponent holds up a mana. We play a Swiss Spear. You shouldn't have played a land first, but, they mana leak. We go ahead and Swiss Spear here. So looking at the start, obviously we have a pretty quick start here. Opponent revealed a Path to Exile, but they don't have any white mana, notably. So we're going to get in for 3 damage here. They did manage to mana leak one of our guys. I'm going to make it more difficult to kill them. They Growth Spiral into no white source, apparently, again. Go ahead and start firing off spells here. The only thing they could really have to interact is Force of Negation or Bolt. They haven't shown us Bolt so far, and we knew they were drawing Path, and then we just get in for exactly lethal here. So, as you can see, although the deck is very powerful, there are some holes that can be exploited in the deck. They didn't even really take any damage from their mana base this game, and yet we still steamrolled them on turn 3. Once again, this is kind of an optimum burn draw, and sometimes that's required to win a matchup like this. Because if you go too long next turn, obviously they could play a basic plane, slam an Omnath, go to town there, or play an Uro, whatever. Once again, the biggest thing with their deck, if you ever look at the mana curve of most of their decks, most of it starts at 2, whether it be Growth Spiral, Mana Leak, Remand, there's very little 1-mana interaction, as a lot of the formats kind of gone into, turbo mid-range mode, or, even the decks that are powerful, like Hammer Time and stuff, one removal spell doesn't always stop it, so sometimes, like Cryptic Command or Archmage's Charm is much more important. Obviously, 4-color doesn't generally play Archmage's Charm, but the Sultai Uro lists do. So, nice to get a win there. Let's take a look at match number 2 and see how things play out differently. Alright, we're back for match number 2. We're on the draw this time, so a little bit different of a setup for us. Looking at this opening hand, obviously, from a burn perspective, this hand is pretty reasonable. The best burn hands have no 1-drop, or have 1-drop creatures. This one doesn't, but we do have a bunch of 1-drop spells. Searing Blaze, obviously, if we knew the matchup, this hand would probably be a mulligan. But game 1, you would be playing on the blind usually. Searing Blaze can either be a 10 or a 3. So, unfortunately, we're going to see the downside of it this time. It leads on Breeding Pool tapped, passes the turn, we draw a land, just allow Spectre Face at sorcery speed, play around any type of counter magic. They obviously have Uro, we just Boros Charm. Can't really stop anything, there's nothing in their deck that can stop that. We go ahead and play Bolt and then Eidolon, obviously sequencing important there. Maybe we're not supposed to throw the Bolt at the face because of Skewer the Critics here, but I think with Eidolon in play, we're going to have an opportunity. Opponent just bolts us, goes to 9, plays another Uro, goes to 12. And here you see the problem with the Bolt strategy against this deck. They're often able to invalidate Bolt effects, and then Teferi is just kind of here to close the door pretty quickly. We're going to try to Rift Bolt them. They have a Remand. Go ahead and suspend the Rift Bolt again. Holding up Skullcrack here, although at this point it's probably completely pointless. They get to likely play an Uro here. We Skullcrack in response. But they're putting a lot of power in play here. And we need a land, and we also need spells here. They go ahead and Cryptic, and then, we're kind of at the point where our Searing Blazes are relatively useless. We can only cast one spell, and Eidolon is actually going to be a detriment to us. Although we could potentially play it as a chump blocker. Maybe it was a premature concession here, but I think we're in enough of a hole that if they untap with Uro and attack, they're going to 10. And there's really no singular draw in our deck that gets us to that point. So we're basically dead over the next, turn cycle. As they, they hit us for 10. Actually, no, we're just dead on board. It's probably why I can see it here. I mean, we could play Eidolon, but then we're not really doing anything constructive. What's our best draw? A land would allow us to deal them 9 damage next turn. Searing Blaze, Skewer the Critics. But we'd still have to survive that turn. That would presume them having no, removal spell or anything. And... yeah, or they could just tuck it with Teferi. So yeah, even playing Eidolon there wouldn't have done anything. They just would have tucked it with Teferi, even barring not having any other cards in their hand, and then just attack for lethal. So we were dead on board. It's one of the things about their deck is they can present, a fairly quick clock in certain respects. Especially when they go Uro. That's one of the things about an all burn hand is it's a lot harder to get there against the deck that's gaining 3, gaining 3, gaining 4, gaining 4. So, some hands that are presentable in a lot of matchups just aren't particularly good with burn anymore. But look at sideboarding and game number 2 in this match. So for sideboarding this time around, I did a little bit less. I just basically removed the Searing Blazes and put in the 2 copies of the 1 copy of Skullcrack and the 2 copies of Roiling Vortex. Don't necessarily know if Rest in Peace Path is correct over a Rift Bolt. Obviously we saw Remand out of them, so not the best card necessarily in our deck. So as far as the sideboarding, I'm not quite sure which one's correct. Once again, we're kind of looking at a similar hand. Obviously this hand's got 15 points of burn. 2 lands. Overall it's pretty solid, but we're playing against an Uro deck, so you could consider mulliganing this, but I do think on the play this is a keep. Lead on the fetch land as we don't have any Searing Blazes in our deck. So Suspend the Rift Bolt, just get in for some damage. Suspend another Rift Bolt, Skewer, just get as much damage in as we can. Opponent not interacting whatsoever. They play Uro, we Lightning Helix, just kind of maintain life totals as they are. Kind of bluff here, but they just have another Uro. And like I said, these are just the kind of hands that, you know, you really can't consistently beat them just relying on life gain. They have a path. Here, I think we take the opportunity to Lightning Helix. They could obviously have Force of Negation, but, you know, not really relevant. You know, we're getting to the point where they're going to get an Uro back, and you know, we need to resolve our spells, and then they just start the Omnath train, getting a bunch of life. Now they're going to put a bunch of pressure in play, and, you know, all they have to do is just attack us a couple of times and we're dead. Once again, might be a premature concession, but, you know, they have some Uros chilling out in the graveyard, so they'll probably get an Uro back next turn, chunk us for a bunch. And, you know, 13, there's no one draw step here. You know, we can put them to 4, and they go back to 7, and there's no one draw step that obviously deals them 7 damage. So, you know, you kind of saw the both ends of the spectrum there. Match number 1, you saw the really good creature starts that can get underneath their stuff, and then you saw, you know, actually pretty good burn hands overall, but just good burn hands, not without creatures, just aren't particularly good against the Uro Omnath deck, even with their not necessarily their fastest draws in the world. So, I'll be back in a sec with the wrap up for the deck. Alright, we're back for a quick wrap up with our Burn versus 4-color Omnath from the Burn perspective. The video that will be coming out probably tomorrow or in a day or two will be from the 4-color Omnath perspective, and it will be a completely different set of matches. It won't be the same matches. Takeaways from this, I think I've kind of alluded to. Obviously, the creature starts are the best against at least the current builds of 4-color Omnath. Getting your creatures down early, pressuring them. But while their mana is a little bit awkward, while maybe they have to play a tap land on 1, you know, getting in some shots with Swift Spear and Goblin Guide before their Uros come down, you know, and then it allows you to hold up mana, maybe leverage your Skull Cracks and stuff to keep them from getting life. Once again, they can't force some negation during their own turn whenever they're playing Uro. So, you know, especially in the early turns, turn 2, 3, 4, when they're kind of limited on mana, kind of when you need to strike and do the most damage. As far as the specifics, this was just a build that I had seen that done well recently. You know, had a lot of the cards that I wanted to see overall in some other matchups that we'll be playing against. Roiling Vortex, obviously pretty key card in the matchup. We didn't get to see it in either matchup, but, you know, really, ideally, Burn doesn't want to play a long game against this deck anyway. As far as Graveyard Hate, I would default towards Relic of Progenitus rather than Rest in Peace. 1, it's a mana cheaper. 2, it can cantrip in the mid to late game, allow you to keep the gas flowing. It's not quite a dead card like Rest in Peace. As far as Path to Exile, I would definitely need to play more of the matchup to know whether Path is worth it. Obviously, there's some spots where it's really good. There's some other spots where you're just ramping them and giving them a zombie, so killing their dude really isn't getting you too far, other than potentially stopping their life gain. From the 4-color side, obviously it's really kind of hard to say before we actually see things from their perspective, what cards are, you know, there's probably some Ether Gusts that came in, there are probably some Celestial Purges that came in. Obviously they could have something like Timely Reinforcements, Weather the Storm if they really wanted to beat Burn. And that's kind of really the crux Burn finds itself in a lot of these matchups, right? Like, you know, decks like this, Heliod Company, Red-Black, Death Shadow and such. You know, a lot of these decks have aces in the hole or cards that can make the matchup significantly worse for Burn. So Burn kind of has to, you know, play that matchup lottery a little bit where, you know, it's not a high percentage of the matchup or a high percentage of the meta, and people aren't gunning for it. Unfortunately, there is some overlap with decks like Mono Red Prowess, Red Black Shadow, Red Black Midrange. You know, deck cards like Ether Gust. You know, such cards that people are going to be bringing in. The nice part, obviously, against playing against Burn, or playing with Burn, is it's not as vulnerable to removal spells. However, the format isn't largely about removal spells as much anymore. It's about the very powerful cards that have incidental things like life gain attached to them, which can be problematic for Burn. You know, but as you saw in match number 1, we can win the matchup with our good draws. You know, there are some holes you can exploit in 4-color Omnath. And obviously this build probably isn't optimized to face it, but you do want to maximize on anti-life gain stuff. Have a little bit of anti-graveyard stuff for Uro, particularly, especially Relic of Progenitus, Rest in Peace. Some people like Surgical Extraction. I'm not a huge fan of Surgical particularly. I understand the theory behind it, but I tend to like cards that replace themselves in those kind of matchups or do something meaningful like Rolling Vortex when it's in play. That's why I'm not a huge fan of Rest in Peace against them or against Jund, but I am a huge fan of Relic. It's all kind of like nuanced, and maybe it's not really as big a deal as I think it is, but just something to keep in mind when you're building your deck with 4-color Uro being one of the top decks in the format, is you need to keep that deck in mind. And Burn can beat it, but it requires specific draws and maybe a little bit of stumbling on the part of the 4-color Uro deck. So, if you like this kind of video, please leave a comment down below. If you don't like this video, please let me know why. This style of video, let me know why. Once again, I do apologize. It's the replay style. I do find these to be a little bit better when you're explaining play lines and such, especially when we're not playing in leagues as much anymore. So, I find it a little bit more useful to explain my line of thought, my sideboarding tips, etc. When I'm looking at things from both perspectives. So, as always, this has been John for MTG Nexus.